Hi, this is Phoenix, and I'm going to make the case against polarization. Polarization I'm going to use in two different contexts. One of them is a kind of personal polarization, which is where you have cognitive dissonance. Within your mind, you have two opposing ideas, and you're not sure which one is right because both views are so extreme. And then I want to specifically address a more generalized notion of polarization, which is when you have two groups or two individuals who are so radically opposed in their views that they don't just disagree, but they can't get along, they can't cooperate, and because they can't cooperate, a lot of friction ensues, a lot of conflict, and it makes things really difficult. So I want to start off by talking about Quine's idea of his web of belief. The web of belief is Quine's idea that a web of belief would normally be fine if you were going to attack like the edge of it. The web would stay strong, but if you attack the center of it, that's when the web starts to disintegrate and to fall apart. And this is the idea that the web is stronger the weaker the ideas are that come to challenge it, but the stronger that the ideas are, the more likely that this web of belief will be overhauled. Now, this was in the context of the philosophy of science. There's a lot of arguments that can be derived from this idea of the web of belief, such as the idea that this is how science works, that basically we need some really strong counter evidence, such as Einstein's theory of relativity, to overhaul the system. Einstein's theory of relativity, of course, overhauled the Newtonian view of the world in a lot of ways, and of the universe in a lot of ways. But Quine's idea is that this is how rationality works, that rationality stays strong because we don't allow strong ideas to challenge our notions. But in order for there to be true progress, these notions have to be challenged, and the web of belief has to be overhauled. And the point that I want to bring up is this is exactly why polarization seems to occur, because our rationality is structured that way, in a sense, because we have strong beliefs, because we've reasoned through things, and it's very hard to bring in new information. And so thus, our web of belief might seem strong to us, and we're willing to not change it, even though we need to change it in order to have a more coherent worldview, so to speak. So that's one of the reasons why it's hard to have open perspectives and why polarization occurs, whether personally or in the public sphere. Now, there's this great idea that the more mental models we have of the world, the more accurately we can make predictions. So again, this is another idea in favor of open perspectives and not being polarized. So if we have one grand idea, which means we're basically just a hedgehog, to use certain metaphors, we have one big idea, but that big idea is likely to fail because it is so grand. But if we have multiple smaller ideas, there's a higher chance that we can predict the world accurately because there's more boxes, so to speak, to choose from, and more truths or possible truths to choose from, and more to mix, more ideas to mix together. And that allows us to have multiple models of the world that we can draw from whenever we need to make predictions about what's going to happen. And of course, this has a lot of different applications, but that's one of them. And so this is in favor of, so obviously if you have, it's in favor of being against polarization, because it's essentially saying that, because it implies that when you have one big idea, you're more likely to be opposed and polarized against someone with another big idea that opposes yours. But if you have smaller ideas, but more ideas, there's a bigger chance that there will be less polarization because you have more to choose from. Now, there's a great idea in polarization and polarized cultures that people that have very strong opinions are likely to only select information that supports their worldview. And so this would be a good example of how rationality should not work, because rationality should be open to new ideas to some extent, as even Quine's notion of the web of beliefs would imply, simply because we know that So how do I say this? We know that we need to challenge that web of belief in order for our rationality to be overhauled so we can have a more accurate worldview. That's probably the best way to describe it. And it's very hard whenever we just choose certain truths or certain facts that fit our worldview, and we completely shut out the rest, because that makes us, in a sense, closed-minded and prevents us from understanding truth. And in fact, I would say that these selective views are not truth. And again, it's very limiting to this idea of open perspectives. Now, there's one more view I'd like to describe, and that's the communitarian view. And communitarianism is a view that was in reaction to the strong views of thinkers like John Rawls of individualism and their ideas of individual rights. And they argue that liberal society, which places emphasis on the individual, can only come about because of communities, because indeed it's our communities that essentially shape us. And so communitarianism is a reaction against intense and strong individualism and excess individualism. And if you think about it, their claim that the community creates liberal society makes sense, because we need our families, we need our communities, our local communities, our neighborhoods, our churches, our schools, our universities, and the like, in order to shape us, and political institutions. We need those to shape us because we need to understand what the common goals are of the community. We need to understand the common goals of the community, because there is a danger in excess individualism. So, for instance, if you want to be part of the polis, you can't really assert your individual ideas if you don't know what the community is thinking and you're not aware of how the community is shaping you and your own beliefs. And so that's why the communitarians would argue that that liberal society can't exist, an individualistic society can't exist without the community. And so again, this entails the idea of open perspectives, of being open to the community, open to what other people in the community have to say. And I think that's extremely crucial to this idea of not being polarized. Because a community, when we think of a community, we think of collectivist societies that work together, where everybody is important and it's not just all about the individual. That may be a little romanticized, but the basic idea is that communities must work together for individuals to have their own freedom. And so one of the ideas that often comes out of it is the idea that in order for an individual to have their individual rights, they have to sacrifice some of those individual rights for the greater good of the community. And so again, that's just having open perspectives and not being shut in with your own views due to excess individualism. So the conclusion that we can draw from all of this is that open perspectives give us more choices. Whether you're looking at Quine's notion of overthrowing the web of belief in order to challenge our beliefs and our belief system, or looking at the views of communitarianism, or having more mental models to make more accurate predictions and the like. So now it has been claimed that that having more perspectives can be good, but it can also lead to contradiction. Now, personally, I'm not really worried about this claim, because even though it can lead to contradiction, that doesn't necessarily mean that it leads to inconsistency. And so what I mean that is, you may be contradicting in your views, but that's because you're entertaining two notions that are very far removed from each other, and you have a grasp on both of them, but you're not letting them polarize you, because you're being very neutral on the perspective. And so another way to look at this is the idea of having neutral perspectives, and this is exactly the role of rationality. And you can see the role of rationality in all of the views that I mentioned above. But this is what rationality should be, which is where we try to take in as much information as we can that wouldn't just support our own opinions or our own worldview, because rationality is an attempt to be objective, and it is an attempt to not just rely on our beliefs. It's an attempt to rationalize through problems. It's an attempt to understand the diversity of situations that exist in the world. And so I'm bringing this up because I feel like it's very easy for cultures or countries, or even on a smaller scale for individuals and communities to fall prey to a kind of polarization. And I have to admit, even though this may be an extreme position in a sense, and it may contradict my ideas of not having polarized views, I'm very opposed against polarization on larger scales, um, such as um, in communities, because I think that it leads to a lot of unnecessary conflict. I think that it leads to a lot of unnecessary conflict and a lot of spinning our wheels and a lot of hostility and a lot of just not getting things done. So a really good example in terms of a community would be the hostility between continental philosophers and analytic philosophers. There's not really much you need to know about them. Just the idea that in philosophy there's two separate groups that actually have open hostility towards each other, and they think that the ways that they go about logic and rationality are wrong. And I think that it personally doesn't accomplish much. I think a little bit is good because it creates diversity, but a lot of it, as you can find in like university departments, is just far-fetched, and it just doesn't accomplish anything. You know, you also see this in politics with the huge divide between Republicans and Democrats, and I think that that whole two-party system divide is extremely excess and doesn't really accomplish much in a lot of ways, because you just have people that are fighting. And so what we need, so the reason why I'm recommending these ideas and why I'm recommending this type of rationality and this use of rationality is because we need to have a diverse way of looking at different problems and different issues, because we can't allow ourselves to be polarized. And so in my opinion, what I think people who are polarized should do is they need to try to take a more neutral perspective. It doesn't mean that they can't believe what they believe. It doesn't mean they can't assert what they believe. But it does mean that they should do it in a way to where they're at least open to the other perspective, in a way that wouldn't create conflict, in a way that is rational and is objective to the goals of everybody. In many ways, because ultimately polarization doesn't accomplish much. And the best way around that is indeed perhaps the communitarian view, or just the view of the community in general, which is that essentially we need to encourage cooperation, and that actually tends to be one of the best ways of with discouraging polarization on a cultural level, or on a larger level or a smaller level, such as between individuals and the like. Now, to close, I'd just like to talk about personal polarization. I struggle with personal polarization to some degree. There's a part of me that wants to be extremely open to things, and there's a part of me that actively criticizes that openness, because I think that it can be very risky in certain ways. I think that it can be limiting in the sense that I'm not sticking with my own convictions and what I believe in. And so it's very frustrating, and it's hard to find the balance, and so that leads to a very intense cognitive dissonance. And so personal polarization can be just as problematic, because we have these two extreme views and we're not sure what to do with them. And they become extreme because there's the cognitive dissonance, like I said, and we're not sure what to do with either view. And we have this dissonance because we don't want to adopt one view over the other, because we would have to pick sides, so to speak. And so the best way that I see of getting around that is, again, just trying to look at things neutrally, look at things from a highly rational perspective. When there's conflict between two ideas or two competing notions that seem to be opposed, and to try to discourage personal polarization, and to try to, again, like I said, just have a neutral perspective. So to close, I would just say that polarization overall, I firmly believe that there's a lot of problems with polarization. I think that it limits us. I think that it leads to too much conflict, whether personal conflict or conflict among other people, and in communities and in cultures and countries. And I think that that's why we need to fight it with the ideas that I mentioned before, particularly the idea simply of just having open perspectives and just being open to other viewpoints. And so, yeah, I hope you enjoyed this talk. And again, this is Phoenix, and thank you.